Most people cling to the conviction that civilization is the ultimate natural antidote to violence. The pervasive belief is that social, political, and technological advancements make us fundamentally less barbaric, inherently more rational, and truly more human. The dominant narrative, taught in schools and amplified by the media, asserts that true violence belongs securely to the past, to the chaotic savagery of tribal wars, the collapse of decaying empires, and history's acknowledged dark periods. Today, within our democratic, modern, and supposedly enlightened societies, we choose to believe we have completely purged ourselves of these primitive, aggressive impulses. But this foundational belief, while deeply comforting to the modern ego, may well be one of the most dangerous and insidious illusions of our time. The unsettling thesis this video explores directly challenges this comfort. Violence has not disappeared with the rise of civilization. Instead, it has been subtly and dangerously refined. Furthermore, it has not only been refined but meticulously incorporated as a functional, strategic tool within the very fabric of our power structures. Modern society does not, in fact, eliminate violence. It learns to manage, channel, and meticulously camouflage it, hiding it behind complex institutions, sophisticated discourses, and suffocating bureaucracies. Direct, visible repression, the stake or the sword, has been systematically replaced by legal punishment, profound symbolic exclusion, and enforced bureaucratic silence. Yet, the core destructive logic remains chillingly consistent. Identify an enemy, project our societal frustrations onto them, and keep them permanently marginalized to ensure the stability and peace of the whole system. This critical perspective is not a modern invention. René Girard, one of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, asserted that violence is the ritual and essential heart of human culture itself. In his groundbreaking work, Violence and the Sacred, he fundamentally argues that social cohesion has historically been forged and maintained through the constant mechanisms of imitation, rivalry, and ritual sacrifice. To maintain its fragile structure, he concludes, society needs victims to remain united. These victims are not randomly
anger, our deep-seated fear, our raw, destructive instinct does not simply disappear into the void. He called this hidden, morally rejected side of the personality the shadow. When a society, obsessed with its self-image of civilization, demands that we completely repress our natural aggressive impulses, this enormous psychological energy must find an outlet. It is inevitably projected outward. Minorities, political enemies, lower social classes, marginalized groups, all become convenient repositories for the very moral failings, fears, and aggression that we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves. This video proposes an unflinching deep dive into this uncomfortable reality, the endemic violence that permeates our daily lives, the constant battles on social media, the harshness embedded in public policies, the selective outrage in news reports, the toxicity of polarized discourses, is not a regrettable failure of the system. It is, disturbingly, an essential and functional part of its operating mechanism. The modern individual, often genuinely convinced of their own moral superiority, frequently acts as an unconscious accomplice to deeply violent systems, all the while firmly believing they are champions of peace and order. This systematic repression of violence, both at the individual and collective levels, achieves only one result. It generates increasingly sophisticated, indirect, and far more difficult to identify forms of aggression. Is a truly intrinsically peaceful society actually possible? Or are we simply engaged in a historical transaction, trading crude swords for complex algorithms, medieval bonfires for vicious digital lynchings, and ancient colosseums for relentless media tribunals? What becomes of violence when it turns invisible, institutional, symbolic, and psychological? And most importantly, how do we begin the hard work of integrating our own shadow so that we cease to be blind, reactive instruments of this machinery? These are the foundational questions this video seeks to explore, not for empty provocation, but as an urgent invitation to lucidity. Understanding the psychology of violence is, perhaps, the only authentic first step to finally escaping its relentless historical cycle. Human violence has long been conveniently interpreted as a moral failing or an irrational explosion.
Open conflict. Consider two individuals observing an initially neutral object. If one of them shows intense desire for that object, the other immediately begins to imitate that desire. This happens not because they truly want the object itself, but because they desire the other's desire, a powerful sign of status. The object swiftly transforms into a symbol of prestige, status, or identity, and in that moment, conflict is born. Mimetic rivalry transforms the desirable other into a primary obstacle. The desire, which seemed innocuous, becomes the very motor of profound hostility. What is the implication of this individual dynamic for entire societies and nations? The logic is exactly the same. When social groups or even nations enter into complex disputes, the mechanism is unchanged. What begins as a symbolic difference or a competition for resources rapidly transforms, through deep imitation and competition, into entrenched enmity. To prevent this destructive spiral of escalating violence from utterly consuming the community, an ancestral, powerful mechanism is activated: the scapegoat. Girard's central, challenging thesis asserts that the stability of all human culture hinges upon a founding act of violence, the strategic choice of a common victim. In times of widespread crisis, whether social, economic, or existential, society unconsciously selects an individual or a defined group. This victim is someone already perceived as different, strange, or marginal. Society then collectively blames them for every ill, every tension, and every chaos affecting the collective. This chosen victim is then either ritualistically sacrificed or violently excluded. With this act, peace is temporarily restored. Crucially, this peace is achieved not because the real cause of the conflict has been resolved, but because the surging chaos has been safely channeled and discharged toward a single symbolic target. Girard meticulously demonstrates that this brutal process leaves its undeniable traces in founding myths, ancient religions, sacrificial rituals, and even the supposedly rational structures of modern law. Mimetic violence, therefore, functions as the secret, necessary gear of culture. And the most chilling part of his discovery is that it works. The community finds cohesion through collective exclusion, or
collective desire in a constant, low-level conflict. As long as that conflict never directly turns against the entrenched centers of power, violence ceases to be a flaw in the system. It becomes an indispensable part of its design. It is strategically channeled against ideological enemies, vulnerable ethnic minorities, marginalized social classes, or any group that can serve as a release valve for collective emotional discharge. The function is never to resolve the crisis. It is to offer a simulacrum of a solution that ensures the established social hierarchy remains intact. If violence is fundamentally mimetic and structurally necessary, how is it that it remains entirely invisible to the majority of people? Why do so many citizens genuinely believe they inhabit truly peaceful societies, even while participating, often unconsciously, in these brutal mechanisms of exclusion? This is where the profound contribution of Carl Gustav Jung becomes critical, offering the essential psychological explanation for this widespread collective blindness. Next, we delve into the theory of the collective shadow and explore how the modern human psyche dissociates from its own innate aggressiveness.
projecting it outward, and thereby becoming an easy, willing prey for violent systemic forces. If this deep analytical content is resonating with you and challenging your assumptions, please click the subscribe button and join our community. Your support is vital for creating this kind of critical exploration. Thank you. We are taught to believe that we live in societies founded on justice, ethics, and pure reason, that institutions were specifically created to protect citizens and guarantee social peace. But this is a narrative that is both carefully constructed and often profoundly illusory. When we meticulously observe the actual pragmatic functioning of power structures, we perceive something far more unsettling than simple corruption. The elite does not actively combat violence. It manages it with precision as a strategic resource. Instead of risking repression of collective aggression, which could lead to revolt, the system has learned to channel its flow, manipulating its course to preserve political stability and the continuity of power. Violence is not viewed as an error or a problem, but as a tool, provided it is applied selectively and kept outside the
threat, who must be permanently contained. This is not an error in the system. It is its intentional architecture. This cold, calculated logic extends into the mass media, which meticulously selects which instances of violence will be shown, amplified, or completely ignored. Popular protests are invariably labeled as chaotic vandalism. Brutal police repression is justified merely as maintaining order. The suffering of specific groups is naturalized, while others are shielded by an invisible membrane of symbolic and institutional privileges. Public policies follow the same machinery. Instead of making core investments in education, mental health, or genuine reduction of systemic inequalities, measures proven to prevent violence, governments routinely prefer to increase police budgets, toughen penalties, and construct more prisons. The public discourse is always focused on security, but the resulting outcome is grimly predictable. More violence, higher incarceration rates, and greater control. The elite does not want to end violence. It wants to ensure that violence never, under any circumstances, turns against it. This strategic management is powerfully reinforced by fear. Moral panic is an incredibly potent tool for controlling the masses. When the population is made to live under a constant state of threat, be it from crime, terrorism, economic collapse, or social disorder, it becomes significantly more susceptible to accepting authoritarian measures, extreme surveillance, and the suppression of fundamental rights. And who consistently benefits from this state of managed fear? Always the same small group, those who profit most from maintaining the rigid status quo. What is occurring is a complex psychological engineering, a collective conditioning that actively shapes our perception of social reality. The ordinary citizen, deeply convinced of their protected status, fails to realize they are a piece on the board, often an unconscious accomplice to profoundly violent structures. Violence becomes effectively invisible because it has been strategically outsourced, carefully aestheticized, and perpetually justified. The more the individual believes they live in these violent systems. The answer, according to Jung, is found in what the modern psyche vigorously refuses to confront: the collective shadow. For Jung, the shadow is the non-negotiable part of the psyche that houses everything the individual or society consciously rejects, represses, or deems morally unacceptable. This includes aggressive instincts, selfish desires, and all destructive impulses. When these primal contents are not consciously acknowledged and processed, They are violently pushed into the unconscious. They do not vanish. On the contrary, they become significantly more dangerous precisely because they operate entirely outside the realm of consciousness and moral scrutiny. In modern Western societies, where the veneer of rationality, kindness, and public order is paramount, the natural, inherent aggressiveness of human beings is systematically repressed. From the earliest age, we are conditioned to believe that feeling anger is morally wrong, that desiring power is ugly, or that fighting aggressively for oneself is selfish. We internalize a behavioral ideal that ruthlessly suppresses our most primitive, vital forces. And in doing so, we lose contact with our essential psychic wholeness. Jung observed a profound dynamic. When these massive energies are not consciously integrated, they are violently projected outward. This means we begin to see in others, in their flaws, their differences, their moral choices, exactly what we fiercely reject in ourselves. Minorities, foreigners, political dissidents, public figures, they all become perfect targets for these projections. We come to hate in them the raw anger we do not dare to admit, the strength we are afraid to exercise, or the freedom we repress in the name of rigid social order. This psychological process is never merely individual. When an entire society denies its aggressive impulses, a collective dissociation forms, a type of pervasive moral amnesia that allows seemingly good people to support brutal policies, legitimize senseless wars, ignore systemic injustices, and reproduce corrosive hate speech, all while firmly believing they are defending a moral ideal of peace. The shadow, when projected on a large scale, transforms entire societies into unconscious, obedient instruments of systemic violence. This is fertile ground for the rise of ruthless authoritarian regimes, for the rapid advancement of blinding fanaticism, and for the emergence of demagogic leaders who embody the exact raw aggressiveness that society has collectively rejected and which it now secretly admires from a safe distance without taking any personal responsibility. As Jung prophetically said, the greater the ignorance of the shadow, the more the human soul fragments and the more evil grows on a collective scale. Furthermore, the chronic repression of aggressiveness does not merely damage the collective, it profoundly sickens the individual. Many people who proudly label themselves as peaceful, balanced, and civilized are in reality constantly on the brink of emotional collapse. They suffocate their raw impulses for years until a breaking point is reached. It is in this context of chronic repression that Jung describes the formation of autonomous violence complexes, cores of repressed content deep within the psyche, that under certain conditions seize absolute control of behavior. These complexes are precisely like emotional time bombs. An individual may spend years meticulously cultivating an image of kindness, composure, and civility, but it takes only a single trigger, a stressful situation, an unexpected frustration, or a symbolic threat, for a totally disproportionate and explosive reaction to erupt. An outburst of rage, a nervous collapse, or an aggressive act that appears to materialize from nowhere. The individual consumed by this outburst does not even recognize themselves. At that moment, they are not in control. The repressed complex has taken the wheel. Crucially, not all of these complexes manifest visibly or explosively. Jung also identified a far more insidious form of repressed violence: unconscious participation in collective systems of exclusion and punishment. This happens when a person, without conscious realization, adheres fiercely to punitive discourses, legitimizes institutional abuses, shares hateful fake news, or maintains a profound silence in the face of glaring injustices. They do this while proudly maintaining the conscious self-image of a just and balanced person. This is the quintessential behavior of the civilized subject,
who, under the banner of preserving order,
They refuse to recognize their own innate capacity for violence. Any suggestion of an external threat, whether real or manufactured, awakens in them a compulsive, irrational need for defense. It becomes the perfect trigger for accepting authoritarian discourses, implementing repressive policies, and participating in symbolic lynchings, all performed in the name of security, family values, or morality. What is truly occurring is the indirect release of the profound violence that has been internally denied for so long. Jung insisted that this deep dissociation not only leads to individual neurosis, but fundamentally undermines the capacity for psychic growth. The repression of aggression does not generate peace. It generates neurosis, conformism, and complicity. It is no historical coincidence that acts of extreme, sudden violence frequently occur in contexts where intense moral and social pressure dictates exemplary behavior. When the mask of civilization finally cracks, it reveals the psychic abyss that has been tragically neglected. If repression leads to fragmentation and blind complicity, what is the revolutionary alternative? We live under the carefully constructed illusion that civilizational progress has secured our distance from barbarism. But as both René Girard and Carl Jung have revealed, the more a society believes it is peaceful, the more effectively its violence has been displaced to the unconscious, symbolic, or institutional level. The cruelest forms of contemporary violence are rarely committed by visible criminals. They are executed by perfectly legal structures operating in silence, with the chilling bureaucratic coldness of systems that punish, exclude, and kill with nothing more than a signature and a stamp. Violence has been stripped of its explicit raw form. Now it wears a suit, speaks in technical jargon, and acts under the pretext of pure efficiency, order, and linear progress. This is the structural violence, as philosopher Slavoj Žižek might argue, and it is the most dangerous form precisely because it presents itself as neutral, rational, and apolitical. It operates under the seamless guise of normality. The ordinary citizen, by passively adhering to the norms, discourses, and dominant values, tragically becomes an active, as a rational opinion, the moral judgment that conveniently replaces empathy. This mechanism produces the specific contemporary subject, the unconscious accomplice. They do not see themselves as part of the problem because their conscious mind is entirely aligned with order and civility. But their silence in the face of blatant injustice, their adherence to exclusionary rhetoric, and their irrational fear of the other, all of this transforms them into a powerful vector of systemic violence. René Girard asserts, violence is the most effective mechanism of social control precisely because it works best when it is not perceived as such. The elite now needs only to manipulate symbols and control narratives. The crowd, desperate for moral clarity, finishes the rest of the devastating work. But there is a radical path out. Jung proposes that authentic pacification begins when we stop projecting our shadow onto the world and start integrating it consciously. We must recognize that the capacity to hate, to hurt, and to exclude is fundamentally ours. Denying this reality makes us obedient pawns. Recognizing it can make us conscious, free, and profoundly dangerous to a system that depends entirely on our unconsciousness. Carl Gustav Jung did not believe that aggression could be extinguished, nor that it was desirable. Aggressiveness is a vital, primordial energy necessary for life and boundary setting. True psychological maturity lies not in denying these impulses, but in recognizing, accepting, and channeling them constructively. This is shadow integration.
A deep, uncomfortable, and absolutely revolutionary process. It demands the courage to look within and admit that the hate we see externally is often a mirror of what we deny internally. The final, essential question remains: how do we stop being the unconscious instrument of violence? The answer is clear: through radical awareness, through the willingness to see oneself as one truly is, by abandoning the crippling illusion of moral purity. Integrating the shadow is the most revolutionary act a human being can perform. A person who embraces their psychic totality, who no longer needs to project judgment or punish others to